mother shielding her child, two sisters holding each other at the end of everything, a family huddled together under a staircase. These stories were displayed in museums and repeated by every expert who ever walked those streets. They were heartbreaking, they were human, and every single one of them was completely wrong. Scientists just got the DNA results back from inside the plaster casts, and what came out of that lab did not just correct a few small details, it destroyed the entire story. And what the truth actually looks like is so much darker than anyone expected. The stories we told and the tool that broke them. Before we get to what the DNA found, you need to understand what happened to this city first. Because what that mountain did to Pompeii was so savage, so utterly without mercy, that it accidentally preserved something it was never supposed to preserve. The truth. Here is something that should bother you before we even start. The date everyone uses for the eruption is August 79 CE. That date came from a letter written by a man named Pliny the Younger, who witnessed the disaster and wrote to a friend describing what he saw and how people died around him. But here's the thing. He wrote that letter from memory decades later. And in 2018, workers excavating a section of Pompeii found a charcoal inscription on a wall inside the city that pointed strongly to October as the actual date. Not August. October. The letter everyone had trusted for 150 years may have gotten the month wrong. And that matters because it tells you something important before we go any further. Pompeii has been misread from the very beginning. We built the whole story on sources we never looked at hard enough. Now, what actually happened to this city? The mountain did not give a warning that meant anything. There were small tremors in the days before. People felt them and stayed, and before they knew it, the top of the mountain blew open. The sky turned black in minutes. Black like something monstrous had reached up and switched the sun off. The mountain exploded upward, blasting ash and rock 12 miles into the air like a cannon fired straight at the sky. And then it all came back down. Every particle, every rock, every burning fragment fell back and came rushing down the mountain at once in a wall that moved faster than any living thing could run. This was the pyroclastic surge, a boiling mass of superheated gas and ash and shattered rock that swallowed everything in its path without slowing down for a single second. And the temperature inside that wall reached 500 degrees Celsius. I need you to understand what that means because it is not what you are imagining. At 500 degrees Celsius, you do not burn, you do not scream, you do not suffer in the way we think of suffering. Your body simply stops being a body. The flesh, the organs, everything soft ceases to exist in seconds. The people in the streets of Pompeii did not have time to be afraid. One moment they were there, standing in their doorways, running through their streets, holding their children. The next moment, the surge hit, and they were gone before their minds could even finish the thought that something was wrong. The city was not buried slowly. It was swallowed whole and sealed shut in the time it takes to draw a breath. And locked inside all of that hardened ash were the hollow spaces where the people used to be. Here is what made Pompeii different from any other disaster site in history. When the soft tissue vanished inside the ash, what was left behind was not a skeleton. It was a hollow space, a perfect mold of the person's body in the exact position they were in when the surge hit. Outstretched arms, curled fingers, a face pressed into the ground, one arm thrown up to stop something that no arm could ever stop. The heat had been so savage that even most of the bone was gone. What remained were just fragments trapped inside the hollow spaces. But these spaces were invisible. They were sealed inside solid, hardened ash. They sat that way for centuries, until someone finally stumbled upon them. In 1863, a man named Giuseppe Fiorelli was standing over a patch of hardened ash in Pompeii, and he saw something that nobody before him had seen. He realized that buried inside the solid ash were hollow spaces where the bodies used to be. So he did something nobody had thought to do before. He drilled into the ash and poured liquid plaster down into those hollow spaces and waited. The plaster filled them completely and hardened solid into the exact shape of whatever had been there. Then his workers chipped all the ash away from the outside. The ash was gone. But the plaster that had taken the shape of the body inside it remained. That was the cast. And what was sitting there when the last piece of ash fell away stopped everyone on the site completely. It was a human figure, perfectly preserved. Every curve of the body, every position of the fingers. The exact shape of a person in the last second of their life. When the first cast emerged, the workers on that site wept. One man dropped to his knees and pressed his lips against the cast where the face was and kissed it. Then he pulled back and whispered, "You suffered so much." And nobody on that site said a word. The casts became the most famous thing about Pompeii. They were reproduced in books and displayed in museums and visited by millions of people. And the people who looked at those faces did what humans always do. They told stories about them. They gave them names and relationships and roles. They looked at a curled figure and saw a mother. They looked at two bodies pressed together and saw sisters. They looked at four people under a staircase and saw a family. And because those stories felt so true, nobody pushed back on them. Nobody demanded proof. The stories just grew and hardened the way the ash had hardened around the bodies, until they felt like history. But things were about to take a very shocking turn. It all began when scientists brought in a CT scanner. You know what a CT scanner is? It is the machine hospitals use to see inside a living body without cutting it open. They pointed one at the dead ones. 30 casts were selected from the 104 that had been catalogued. The machine scanned each one completely and could see straight through the plaster and the ash all the way down to the bone fragments that had been sealed inside since 79 CE. 14 of those casts had bone clear enough to sample. Technicians drilled cores thinner than a pencil through existing cracks in the plaster, never breaking the outer surface. And 5 of those samples came back with something that nobody had fully expected. Readable DNA! Inside the plaster, inside the ash. After 2,000 years, the dead of Pompeii had left their genetic fingerprints behind. And what those fingerprints said when the results came back was something that nobody in 150 years of Pompeii scholarship had seen coming. And here is something that did not make the news much, but should have. When the CT scanner went through several of the casts, researchers found that the plaster had not filled the void completely. In at least one cast, a small pocket of the original hollow space had never been reached by the plaster at all. It just sat there, sealed inside, untouched. And inside that pocket was air. The same air that had been trapped in there when the ash hardened around the body in 79 CE. 2,000 years of air sitting inside a cast in a museum. Scientists debated whether to open it. They decided not to. Some things, they agreed, should stay sealed. And one more thing before we move forward. Not every scar on those casts came from the volcano. Before proper rules existed in the 19th century, visitors to Pompeii were allowed to walk up and touch the figures freely. Fingers were snapped off as souvenirs. One cast had part of its face destroyed by a visitor who pressed too hard trying to see the expression more clearly. The dead of Pompeii survived 2,000 years buried under a mountain. And then tourists got to them. Out of all 14 sampled casts, only 5 had bone preserved well enough to yield readable DNA. And the first thing the DNA said was that the most famous story in all of Pompeii was a lie. The story of the mother and her child. The most famous story was a big lie. There is a cast known as the House of the Golden Bracelet Group, and if you have ever seen a photograph of Pompeii's victims, you have almost certainly seen this one. An adult figure bent over a small child, one arm wrapped around that child's body. The whole posture of the adult angled forward like a shield. Like the last thing this person decided to do with their life was put their body between a child and the end of the world. And on the adult's wrist, there was a gold bracelet, heavy, ornate, and beautiful. And that bracelet sealed the story for everyone who looked at it. Because what kind of person wears a bracelet like that? A woman. A mother. a woman of means who loved her child enough to stay. Museum guides described her as a mother for 150 years. Every documentary called her a mother. She became one of the most powerful symbols in all of ancient history. The idea that even when a mountain is coming for you, a mother does not let go, and then the DNA came back and it revealed something almost terrifying. The adult in that cast was male, XY chromosomes, a man, completely and without any question, a man, the figure that millions of people stood in front of and wept over. The cast that became the single most recognizable image of parental love in the ancient world. The adult in that cast turned out to be a man. Now here is where it gets damning. The gold bracelet. Everyone who looked at that bracelet saw a woman. But gold jewelry in ancient Rome was not a female thing. High-status Roman men wore gold bracelets and gold rings and gold pins without a second thought. It was a mark of wealth and rank, not gender. There was even a specific military decoration in Rome called the armilla. It was a gold bracelet awarded to soldiers who had shown exceptional courage in battle. Men wore it with pride. It meant you had survived something terrible and done something remarkable in the middle of it. The scholars who looked at that bracelet and saw a mother were not reading ancient Rome. They were pressing their own assumptions backward through 2,000 years of history onto people they had never understood. And every generation after them just copied those assumptions without once stopping to ask whether they were true. And before we go any further, let us be honest about something uncomfortable, because it was not just the scholars, it was all of us. Every person who saw the gold bracelet and thought of course she stayed. Of course a mother would stay. We did exactly what the scholars did. We looked at that figure and filled in the story with what we already carried inside us, what we needed it to be. And we were just as wrong as every historian who came before us. But wait, because it gets worse. The small child curled against that man. The child that every guide and every textbook called his child. That child shared none of his DNA, not distantly, not loosely, none. So now you are left with a question that has no clean answer and never will. Did that man die trying to protect a stranger's child? Did they simply collapse near each other in the chaos, and the ash sealed them together in a way that looked like an embrace? Did he even know the child? We do not know. We will never know. And somehow that not knowing is more devastating than any answer could be. The house itself tells you something darker still. The walls inside the house of the golden bracelet were covered in painted garden frescoes. And these were not simple decorations. They were painted with such precision and such detail that modern botanists have actually used them to identify plant species that were growing in that region 2,000 years ago. Whoever lived in that house had money, taste, and a life built around beautiful things. The man in that cast may have been the homeowner. He may have died in his own garden, surrounded by flowers that were painted so perfectly they would outlast him by 2,000 years, with a stranger's child pressed against his side and no one left who knew either of their names. After the DNA results were published, the cast was quietly relabeled in the official records. The description that had identified the adult as female was formally corrected. But the old story had already spread too far to be pulled back. Travel guides still call her a mother. Documentaries still call her a mother. Tourist literature around the world still tells the same story that the DNA proved was never true. And the DNA had only just started talking, because the mother was not the only lie. The sisters were next. The real truth about the sisters. Underneath one of Pompeii's wealthier homes, there was a long, vaulted stone tunnel called the Cryptoporticus. It ran beneath the house like a hidden passageway, cool and thick-walled and solid. And when the mountains started destroying everything above ground, people ran into it. Dozens of them, screaming, stumbling over each other in the dark. They pressed themselves against the walls and held onto strangers. They squeezed their eyes shut and prayed with everything they had that the stone ceiling above them would hold. They told themselves that the walls were thick enough, that if they just stayed still and stayed together, they would walk out of there alive. The surge did not slow down for the walls. It came through that tunnel like the mountain had saved its worst for last. And every single person inside it died. Among the bodies found in that tunnel, 2 figures were locked together in an embrace that made everyone who saw them stop breathing for a second. One figure's arms were wrapped completely around the other. Their faces were close. Their bodies were pressed together in the way that people press together when the world is ending and the only solid thing left is another human being. It looked like love. It looked like 2 people who had found each other in the worst moment and refused to let go. Tour guides called them sisters for generations. The image was reproduced thousands of times. It became one of the most powerful symbols to come out of Pompeii. 2 women who chose each other at the end of everything. And then the DNA came out and shattered everything. One was male, one was female. They shared no biological relationship whatsoever. They were strangers. Just stop there and feel what that means. 2 strangers, in an underground tunnel packed with dozens of other dying people, in total darkness, in heat so thick it was killing everything around them. And they reached for each other, not because they had grown up together or shared a life. They reached for each other because they were terrified and alone. For long we looked at them and called it sisterhood, because we needed it to mean something we already understood. The misidentification did not happen by accident, and it did not survive by accident. When the casts were first photographed for a major published catalog of Pompeii's figures in the early 20th century, the caption beneath the cryptoporticus image read, "Deux sorelles," 2 sisters. That caption was copied into the next publication, then translated into German, then French, then English, then reprinted across dozens of languages in travel books and academic papers and school textbooks for generation after generation. The sisters never existed. A caption in a catalog created them, and for 100 years, nobody looked hard enough at the bones to ask whether the caption was true. But the cryptoporticus was not the only place the story fell apart, not even close. Under a staircase in another part of the city, 4 bodies were found pressed so tightly together that historians spent over a century presenting them as a nuclear family. A father, a mother, and their children. Near them was a cluster of coins and personal objects, and everyone read that the same way. A family pooling everything they owned to try to survive together. The DNA said otherwise. Not one pair among those 4 people shared close genetic ties, not one. Each person carried completely different ancestry markers. They were not a family. They were 4 total strangers from 4 completely different bloodlines who ended up in the same corner under the same staircase by chance. The coins near them were not pooled. Each person had grabbed what was theirs alone. 4 separate people making 4 separate panicked decisions, ending up in the same spot and getting sealed together into one image that history spent over a century calling a family. Those 4 people did not just come from different families. The ancestry markers in their DNA pointed to completely different parts of the world. They were not neighbors who happened to be strangers. They were people from different corners of an entire empire who ended up in the same city, in the same disaster, in the same dark corner, with no names for each other and no reason to be there together except that the mountain gave them no choice. And where those people actually came from is what the rest of this story is about, because that is the part that burns everything down completely. Pompeii was never Roman. Before I explain what that number means, just hold it for a second. 70%. That is the share of people whose DNA was pulled from those casts across the whole study. Not just the mother, not just the sisters, not just the family under the stairs, all of them. Every single person they sampled and tested. 70% of those people did not trace their ancestry to Italy. They traced it somewhere else entirely. Let me explain why this is so shocking. Pompeii was a Roman city. It sat in southern Italy inside the Roman Empire, and it had been under Roman rule for centuries. So everyone assumed that the people who lived and died there were Roman, Italian, local. That is what every textbook said. That is what every museum presented. A Roman city frozen in time with Roman people inside it. And then the DNA came back. 70% of them did not trace their ancestry to Italy at all. They traced it to the Eastern Mediterranean, to the Levant, to Egypt, to Greece, to North Africa. The majority of the people who burned alive in Pompeii that day were not Roman in any real sense. They were far from home, most of them very, very far. And we put Roman faces on them and hung them in museums and called it history. Here is how scientists figured this out. They took the DNA recovered from the 5 cast samples and ran what is called a genome comparison. They matched the biological markers inside each person's DNA against the known genetic signatures of ancient populations from across the Mediterranean world. Think of it like a biological family tree. Instead of names and photographs, you are reading the markers that different ancient populations passed down through generations. When you find a match, you can trace where a person's ancestors came from even 2,000 years after they died. What came back placed all 5 of Pompeii's recovered individuals closest to ancient populations from the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa, not to the people of Roman Italy. The sample was small. 5 full genomes is not a large number, and the scientists said so openly. But the signal was identical across all 5 of them. Every single one pointed away from Italy and toward the broader world that Rome had built its empire on top of. And 2 of those individuals carried markers specific enough to place their origins in distinct regions. One person's DNA traced strongly to the Eastern Mediterranean Levant. Think of what is now Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and the surrounding lands. Another person's ancestry pointed clearly to North Africa. These were specific people who had come from specific places far from Italy and ended up dying in a city that history would spend the next 2,000 years calling Roman. And then there was the glass. In a thermopolium, which was basically a Roman street food counter, the ancient version of a diner where working people grabbed a quick hot meal, archaeologists found an ordinary glass drinking vessel sitting on the counter. They ran chemical analysis on it, and the results showed it had been made in workshops in Alexandria, Egypt. This was not a luxury import sitting in a wealthy person's home. This was an everyday object on a working-class food counter in a city in southern Italy. Someone in Alexandria made that glass with their hands. It was loaded onto a ship and it crossed the Mediterranean, and it was unloaded at a port and it made its way to Pompeii. It ended up on a counter where someone served food to strangers every single day. And when the mountain came, it was buried there. That glass is a life stretched across an entire empire. It is proof that Pompeii was not a closed Roman town. It was a place the whole world passed through and left pieces of itself inside. But here is the part that lands the hardest. And I want you to be ready for it. Among the skeletal remains found at Pompeii across decades of excavation, not just the cast group, but across the wider site, researchers found individuals whose ankle bones had changed shape. The bone had remodeled over time, which is what bone does when something presses against it for years without stopping. The shape around those ankles had warped and thickened in a very specific way, the way it warps when leg irons are worn for so long that the skeleton itself reshapes around them. These were enslaved people. They could not run when the mountain came. They were still in chains when the ash sealed them inside. They died the way they had lived, with no freedom, no choice, and no record of their names anywhere. Their origins were completely unknown until DNA began to speak. And when historians built the story of Pompeii, the Roman city with its Roman families and its Roman tragedies, these people were erased from it, not by accident, by the same habit of looking at the past and only seeing the parts that are comfortable to see. The 2024 DNA study found that the genetic diversity in Pompeii's sampled population was higher than in almost any other ancient Roman site studied to that point. One researcher said the genetic picture looked far less like a quiet provincial Roman town and far more like a major port city where the whole empire was constantly moving through, leaving people and objects and DNA behind. The image of Pompeii as a frozen snapshot of ordinary Roman life had always been a fantasy. The DNA confirmed it, and then some. And when the study was published, the pushback came fast and it came angry. Italian media and heritage commentators argued that the findings were being overstated, that Pompeii's Roman identity was being deliberately undermined, that there was an agenda hidden inside the science. The research team had to issue a formal clarification. The science was not political. The discomfort was, because people had spent generations building something around Pompeii, a Roman city, Roman faces, Roman stories, Roman grief. And the DNA was threatening that at its foundation, and people felt it. The dead had no say in any of that. They never had. Here is what the DNA actually proved when you put every piece of it together. These people were buried twice. The first time by the mountain. Whether it was August or October of 79 CE does not matter. The second burial was ours. We buried them in the stories we needed them to tell. We turned a man into a mother because we saw gold on his wrist and filled in the rest ourselves. We turned two terrified strangers into sisters because a caption in a catalog said so and nobody checked. We turned four people who had never met into a family because they were close together in the ash and it felt right. And underneath all of it was a city full of people from Egypt, the Levant, Greece, and North Africa, and places we will never fully name, people who had crossed oceans to get there, people who were dragged there in chains and had the shape of those chains burned into their bones. And we looked at all of them and called them Roman and left it at that. The DNA cannot give them back their names. It cannot give them back their languages or their gods or the people they actually loved. It cannot undo 2,000 years of a story that was never really about them. But it gives them back the one thing that kept being taken away, the truth of who they actually were.